All right, good day, everyone. Welcome to today's roundtable conversation event held by the Conversational Society of Philosophy. As part of our desire to encourage conversations amongst colleagues in African philosophy, and to also foster the development of the discipline by encouraging critical engagement with the theories and ideas of contemporary African philosophers. The Conversational Society of Philosophy, the CSP, has resolved to organize roundtable conversations on the ideas and philosophies of original contemporary African thinkers, where their ideas are engaged both orally in roundtable events such as this and in written form in terms of articles and article conversations. So it is in line with this that we today are gathered here to have a critical engagement with Professor Matolino, Bernard Matolino, conversing with his Afro-communitarian theory of democracy. Now, before we begin, let me give a brief introduction to Professor Matolino. Let me read his bio. So Professor Bernard Matolino is a professor of philosophy at the University of Pretoria, as well as an honorary professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. His major areas of research are in African political theory, the theory of race, and racism. Now, his philosophy is has influenced and continues to influence African philosophical scholarship, especially African political philosophy. And his ideas, which are famous for being somewhat radical, have continued to inspire young scholars and his contemporaries, such as ourselves, in examining the various tenets of political philosophy. In 2013, alongside Wenceslas Kwindingwi, Professor Matolino declared the end of Ubuntu in their article, The End of Ubuntu, published by the South African Journal of Philosophy. That article has continued to gain more traction, more citations, and more critical engagement over the years. His other written works include Afro-Communitarian Democracy, Consensus Democracy in Africa, as well as Personhood in African Philosophy, where he outlined his famous limited communitarianism. So in today's discussion, we are going to examine some of the core tenets of Professor Matolino's political philosophy. And to help us critically engage with him, we've gathered a few internationally recognized scholars of African political philosophy to interrogate some of his ideas and draw out the good points and the weak points. One of those discussants that we have today is Dr. Joyline Gwara. Dr. Joyline Gwara is a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy, Religion, and Ethics at the University of Zimbabwe. She's a holder of a PhD from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Pietermaritzburg, South Africa. She also did her Master's of Arts in Philosophy and Bachelor of Arts Honors in Philosophy at the University of Zimbabwe. She is the first female to have a doctorate in philosophy in Zimbabwe, and she's also a member of the Conversational Society of Philosophy. Her teaching interests and research interests include a wide range of themes in African philosophy and biomedical ethics. Another discussant, another conversationalist that we are going to have today is Dr. Simon Makwinja. Dr. Makwinja is a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy, University of Malawi. His doctoral thesis was in African philosophy and was promoted by our very own Professor Bernard Matolino. Simon's interests include African value systems, human dignity, human dignity and rights, African traditional thoughts. He has taught philosophy undergraduate courses for over 10 years. Among the courses he has taught over the years include Introduction to Logic and Scientific Methods, Epistemology, Philosophy of Religion, African Philosophy, and what have you. He has made a modest contribution of some scholarly articles and book chapters in the discipline of philosophy. Dr. Simon was awarded his doctorate of philosophy degree by the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and he was awarded a joint Master of Human Rights Practice by the University of Roehampton in the UK, Gothenburg University in Sweden, and the University of Tromsø in Norway. He was also awarded a Master of Arts in Philosophy by the University of Malawi, Chancellor College. Last but not least, conversationalist for today would be Dr. Motsamai Molefe. Dr. Molefe obtained his Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and Psychology at the University of Witwatersrand. After graduating in 2006, he obtained his MA degree in Development Studies from the University of Witwatersrand. And he received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. He was a lecturer in ethics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and a senior lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand. Dr. Molefe is a director and founding member of African Political Theory Association, APTA, and he is currently a senior researcher at the Center for Leadership Ethics in Africa at the University of Fort Hare, South Africa. Some of his important books include An African Philosophy of Personhood, Morality and Politics, African Personhood and Applied Ethics, and African Ethics of Personhood and Bioethics, a reflection on abortion and euthanasia. I'd like to thank all our discussants and the Professor Matolino for agreeing to be part of this event. And I would like to invite immediately Professor Matolino to give us an overview of his political philosophy, after which our discussants would have time to respond to what he has to say. So, Professor Matolino, I invite you to give us a talk on some of your ideas and your philosophical views. Thank you.
Very much, colleagues. Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you so much for your time. I don't know if you heard me, but thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you very much for your time. And thanks so much to the organizers of this event. Yeah, I hope you can see me clearly. Yes. Thank you very much. It's always one of those things when you are asked to speak about your ideas, you really don't know what to say. So I thought that the best way to approach this session will be to give what I consider to be a brief overview of the motivation of how I come to formulate and commit myself to the sort of ideas that are now associated with me, and in a way these ideas are always unfolding. It's one of those things that's unique about philosophy, which I consider to be an advantage, that you're allowed to change your mind as time goes on. I can say in terms of consensual democracy, what I wrote is my first installment in that area, which was a reaction to Emmanuel Ise, which expressed my support, probably, though muted, for Wiredu. If I were to be given an opportunity to do that all over again, I do not think I'll write that paper in the way that I did. Because as you can see in democracy as consensus, I've moved away from that kind of blind admiration and support for consensus. But before we get there, the starting point really for me is got to do with what I worked on my PhD, and which also became my first book, and something that I was associated with for a very long time. And I'm happy that I'm not so much associated with that field of personhood. I've left it in capable hands of some of our friends, including Professor Motsamai, Molefe, who is here amongst us. But I just want to discuss personhood so that you may get an understanding of how it links with my political work. If you've read the text, you will see that what happens in the first two chapters is that I battle against the characterization of the theory of persons on the continent. How do I battle that? I battle it by virtue of wanting to reconfigure how the so-called theses of personhood are to be presented on the continent. The taxonomy at times gave 3 theses, and at times it gave 4. And I come in and I reduce them to 2. Now, I don't want to go into the details of those arguments. I seem not to have convinced anybody who works in personhood, but it's very important for me to say this. I reduced them into 2. So I got rid of things like the shadow thesis, things like the force thesis. And I said what we must be left with is what we may call the communitarian notion of personhood and the metaphysical view of personhood. And there's a very good reason why I did that. I did that because I thought that this notion of personhood was open to this kind of reduction that I was doing. Because if you look at the force and the shadow thesis, you could say the force thesis is properly communitarian and the shadow thesis is properly metaphysical. So we don't have to multiply entities beyond what's necessary to follow the famous or infamous Occam's razor. But there was also another function that I had in mind, which I thought was absolutely important, and it would help us in understanding what personhood was all about. It was the idea that the concept of personhood has got uses beyond what we understand the conceptual scheme to be. So it's not a discussion that ends there. A person plays him or herself out in ways that are interesting for all sorts of purposes, particularly in African philosophy. It's very obvious with the communitarian thesis. But I also thought that there were some implied commitments that were to be found in the metaphysical thesis. For example, to understand why Africans take ancestors seriously, or why Africans have got the attitude that they have towards the dead, one must have a proper grasp of what the metaphysical thesis says about persons, both in life and the afterlife. Be that as it may, what I found particularly interesting was the idea that communitarianism seemed to have received greater prominence than the metaphysical theory. And I tried to mount an argument that wanted to show that there are no good reasons why this is the case. And if there are no good reasons why this is the case, then we actually have good reason to take both orientations seriously. And if we take both orientations seriously, then we may have certain implications bearing on us. Well, one could say, was I advocating just a matter of making a choice between communitarianism and the metaphysical theory just because they can both be taken seriously? No, that's not what I was doing. What I was doing was, at the very least, attempting to demonstrate that if you take one of these orientations seriously, you are likely to end up with radically different commitments, particularly to the famous phrase, the sociality of the self on the African continent. So I have wanted to take the metaphysical strain quite seriously. Why? Because I think it frees us of the burdens that are unnecessary, that are imposed on us by burdens and restrictions that are imposed on us by the communitarian thesis. Because in the communitarian thesis, there are lots of implications, such as what the moral worth and orientation of an individual should be, and how that individual is to understand him or herself as a political agent, and how that individual is expected to behave as that kind of political agent. With the metaphysical theory, everything is pretty much up in the air, because what we just told are the concomitant properties that constitute a person, without necessarily moralizing or politicizing us about what the expectations of that person are going to be. In taking my metaphysical strain seriously, I should say, and as far as I can recall, there are not many who take the metaphysical orientation seriously, and there are even fewer who take the consequences of the metaphysical orientation seriously. So I've found myself isolated in what I talk about, and as Dr. Ribi said, it may sound strange to a lot of people, but that's my starting point. I take the metaphysical orientation seriously, and I think it helps us in understanding what a person is without the social context that we see in the communitarian thesis. My second thinking is influenced by what I think African philosophy should be all about. I think African philosophy is essentially an evolving enterprise. While there are many who are attracted to the traditional aspect of African philosophy, I have confessed in many places that I have no connection with traditional Africa. If you go back to personhood in African philosophy, I give a sort of an autobiographical note on where I grew up, which is in an average township in Zimbabwe, and it was exciting for all sorts of reasons, but I also didn't know a lot of things, and the notion of community that is discussed by communitarians is certainly something that I did not experience as a young person and as a young adult, and certainly where I live now is when I wrote that book in 2014. I also included a narration of how I lived in Johannesburg and how I found the place to be uniquely non-communitarian in many respects. Now I live in Pretoria, and where I live, I find a place to be worse than Joburg, because none of my neighbors so far have been here for 8 weeks. None of my neighbors have even come to greet me or to ask who I am. So I am still puzzled by serious thinkers who write about African philosophy's commitment or underpinning of sociality or community or Ubuntu or things like that, because my experience is not being consistent with that. But okay, it's my experience. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe I'm the one who's weird. Maybe I'm the one who's got a problem. Maybe I am the one who is antisocial. But let's look at the facts. You see, what is happening in Africa, and is what is happening in Africa in favor of the promotion of any sense of community, or it's actually undermining of the community? Now, this is my thinking. I think Africa is a victim of colonialism and all other ills, including neocolonialism and failed post-colonial projects, is a place which breeds, brews, rears, and promotes individual agency that is not appropriate for any sense of community. I'll give you 2 examples of countries that I'm most familiar with. I'll start with Zimbabwe, country where I was born, and which has become dysfunctional at many levels. And everybody agrees and everybody acknowledges that Zimbabwe is a problematic place. Even government officials admit that. But we're not worried about the politics. What I'm worried about is Zimbabwe as a place of the birth of this notion called Ubuntu, Unu, as they call it in Shona. Ubuntu has largely disappeared in Zimbabwe. And what has facilitated the disappearance of Ubuntu in Zimbabwe? It is the change in the social nature of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is now a place where an individual strives to survive for the day, for the week, for the month, and does so by all means they imagine necessary and possible, and that involves a great deal of cheating other people. That's just the fact. Even your own relatives will try to rob you or cut a corner with you or get something out of you. Everything that we hear about the core principles of Ubuntu have disappeared in the psyche of Zimbabweans as they execute their public life as individuals. Now, you can't have individuals who are committed to survival by any means, including cheating, robbing, and lying, who have been pushed into that position because of the social infrastructure that they find themselves in. You can't then expect them to be proponents in their public agency of a sweet theory such as Ubuntu. It just doesn't happen. So there's a break there. So I wonder, when people talk about that, isn't it more productive to have a theoretical analysis of the reality of Zimbabwe post-Ubuntu, the reality of Zimbabwe post-2000, the reality of Zimbabwean agency post-2000 or something like that? Then I turn to South Africa. South Africa has got some of the most complicated social and economic problems that rear their head, heads, I don't know how many there are. Every time we talk about South Africa, we are deeply steeped in the negative. In the negative in what sense? South Africa features very strongly on all wrong indices: wanton murder, high rates of rape, the difference between citizens in terms of citizens who have and those who have nothing is unbelievable. The mushrooming of scholar camps, I call them scholar camps. Some people may have nice terms for them, but mushrooming of scholar camps. What are scholar camps meant to do? They are meant to dehumanize. They do not restore humanity. They're meant to affirm your position as one who exists on the periphery of real society. But if you look at that real society, what happens within that real society? What society considers itself normal when it has got more private security guards than the police force? When those who have something live behind high walls with panic buttons around their necks? When the private security industry generates so much money from just providing alarms and armed guards, etc. And then you seriously say you expect citizens of such a country to be equipped and capacitated citizens who can participate meaningfully in the satisfaction of the demands of Ubuntu? I do not think so. What is my point? I think that Africa, whether we talk about a specific country or generally, it's a place that's evolving. And how is it evolving? It's a place that is Kwasi Wiredu wisely says in some instances, but quickly forgets that when he begins to advocate other strange things, such as the radical communitarianism of Menkiti. For better or worse, the past is gone. And as Emmanuel Ize will say, there is no way of quantifying what the real meaning of the disruption has been, because we did not transition voluntarily into this modern stage. We were transitioned into this modern stage through the aid of colonialism, and the aid of colonialism was not meant to empower us, it was meant also to dehumanize us. And we must take seriously the capacity of the colonial project to dehumanize the African and to leave the African without identity. The only alternative that is there for some of us is to resuscitate the past by claiming that these values are to be found everywhere within the continent. I do not think so. When we've got things such as the Zondo Commission and they tell us shocking stuff about what happens when we're not looking, I do not think those are the kinds of values that animate this society. Given a chance, any average citizen of the two countries that I've just mentioned now is willing to make a quick move, even if it's illegal and even if it's not in the interests of the community, to promote their own interests. The third part that moves me is the actual desperation that I see on the continent. Now here we want to talk about real truths that exist. We should not philosophize. We must start with basic facts. What are the basic facts that I'm referring to? I refer to the qualitative measure of African life. You can use any form of measurement from any academic field or any professional field that is interested in measuring qualitative experiences of people's lives, and Africa falls short in all respects. ranging from malnutrition to early deaths to GDPs that are very low, to people who basically live from hand to mouth on less than $1 or $2 a day, to people who are severely diseased, people who are massively ignorant, people who live under dictatorial regimes. Look, according to some reports that came out, I think towards the end of last year or the beginning of this year, there are only 8 African countries that are truly democratic or truly free. And of those 8, 4 are island nations. Of the remaining 4, 2 or 3 are to be found in Southern Africa. And the other one that features is Ghana sometimes, and dubiously Nigeria is included in that list, or they switch positions, Ghana and Nigeria. I don't really believe that Nigeria is that free, but those are the professionals who have done those measurements. So now look at this: 8 countries, 4 are island nations, 2 or 3 are in Southern Africa, but truly free, truly democratic countries. And the rest, you ask yourself, what is the qualitative experience of urgency, political urgency, social urgency, economic urgency of Africans who litter this landmass called Africa? I can only imagine that it is not good. I can only imagine that it is not good. Why do I say so? You see, as philosophers, we must stop playing games, sometimes games that do not make sense. I think most of us have traveled around the continent. We've gone from place to place and we have seen what things look like. I will tell you, I remember at the time I was really moved. I was really moved. We were in Dar es Salaam. And Dar es Salaam, for those who've been to Dar es Salaam, you will know is very notorious for its traffic. The traffic there is just, so you have to really calculate when you move that you encounter less traffic. That is, we're moving, and this is the time that we're told our traffic flows. All I did was just to look outside the car and see what was happening, just to look. So we're traveling, if you know, from a place called Bagamoyo into Dar es Salaam. It's about 30 or 40 kilometers from Dar es Salaam. And that road from Bagamoyo to Dar was full of young people who had strength and clear energy and who had their whole lives ahead of them. But it was also clear that their present and their future was wrecked. Why? Because they were just sitting by the roadside, either selling small wares, fruits, roasted vegetables, or they turned into some cottage industry, little private industry where they were welding or making some little furniture items. And by just looking at them, their faces were grim. They carried a story of poverty, they carried a story of hopelessness, and they carried a story of desperation. These are people who are essential, and this story can be replicated in Kinshasa, it can be replicated in Kampala, it can be replicated even here in Johannesburg. And this is the reality of millions and millions and millions of Africans. And that's the story that I pick up on in my Afro-communitarian democracy. I am interested in what sort of political theorization that we can come up with that will at least minimally satisfy what we understand to be a truly democratic dispensation, but also minimally satisfy the day-to-day material needs of African people. I'm not even talking about highly sophisticated things such as freedom, because Africans not only lack freedom by virtue of the fact that most of the countries on the continent are considered to be repressive, but they are also unfree on empty stomachs. unfree on very little information or no information at all, and unfree where there is no possibility of them imagining any different future. So African political theory has got a serious task, according to my view, of not only theorizing as if the past was still relevant to us, or as if there is no present worrying material deprivation that's going on the continent. African political theory must be sensitive to the realities that we are experiencing now, which brings me to my last point. What kind of a philosopher do I think the African philosopher should be? We have been told that there are two types of philosophers. There is what was called the Greek model of philosophizing, which was to go abstract and leisurely talk about possibilities that were not immediately available to the present. And there is the Egyptian model of philosophizing, whereby philosophy was seen as an everyday reflection of things that bothered real people, where the wise person tries to come up with answers and solutions to everyday questions that bother everyday people. If indeed we are to be relevant as philosophers on this continent, our relevance is not to be found in exorbitant theorization, which has got no rhyme with what's happening on the continent, I think, at least as a political philosopher. But we must start our reflections from the realities that we encounter on an everyday basis. In my conversation with Brucians, I decried the fact that on the continent, there is sparse writing on poverty, for example. There's sparse writing on development from a philosophical point of view. There's even sparse writing on how urgency can be understood anew in the post-colonial confusion that we're faced with in the present day. Those are the things that drive me. And I do take seriously the fate of excluded people, people who operate on the fringes, the poor, the beneath the poor, and those whose status does not respond to any kind of measurement. They are just so out there. There's nothing you can do. Their life does not respond whatsoever. That is what worries me. That is what I think about. And that is what drives my thinking and philosophy, both in rejecting certain theories as outdated. Ubuntu is certainly one of those theories. Thank you very much. I think this is what I had to say. I'm interested in hearing what my respondents have to say. Thank you so much, Chair.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Matolino. As usual, your talk was riveting. I enjoyed myself and also learned a lot. I'll quickly call on our first respondent, Dr. Joyline Gwara, to give a response to what Professor Matolino has said. Dr. Joyline. I think you're still muted.
All right, thank you very much, Arabia. And thank you very much, Professor Matolino. And I also want to thank the organizers of this program for allowing me this opportunity to converse with my supervisor. First of all, I will try to give my own understanding of Matolino's philosophy, as it were. And then at the same time, try to look at what I think or what I deem to be the merits of his philosophy, as well as some of the demerits of his philosophy, as it were. So first of all, I'll note that the Matolino's work starts from the point of view that he notices some of the problems that we encounter in our African societies, And these problems, according to him, are problems that can actually be avoided. And the reason for him could be internalistic, and it's both internalistic as well as externalistic. So also in line with this, he notices that we cannot continue to ignore or to pretend as if African communities have not been affected after colonialism. In other words, notices that the current communities that we are living in face a lot of challenges, and so these challenges cannot be addressed by a theory that is based on harmony, like what he has just been saying, talk of the theory of Ubuntu and yeah. So now what I've understood about Matolino is that he thinks that we should look at maybe as his starting point, the relationship that exists between the individual and the community in light of these existential challenges that I've just highlighted. And then in light of that, we should also take into consideration the lived experiences of Africans who are subjects with real experiences of life. Now, this warrants for him to rethink to rethink communitarianism, and thereby the new communities with which these economic and social and political challenges vis-a-vis the individual agency. Now, you notice that there has been a problem with communitarianism, and some of the challenges that communitarianism presents is to try to understand the individual or the individual interest is coming, or community interest is coming prior to individual interest. And for him, this is problematic. Now, according to Matolino, whatever theory that we can think of which is communitarian in nature cannot escape the fact that individuals exist is distinct from their existing communities, right? So now, this communitarian understanding, according to Matolino, and which is why he has a problem with it, has impacted negatively on the African political theory, and in particular questions to do with democracy in Africa. And just like what he has been saying, Africa has been deemed as a continent that is undemocratic, but Matolino notices that this charge is simply because Africans are using foreign theories of democracy. And for instance, we're talking of liberal democracy, which do not have the supporting structures to work in African societies. Now, this has led him to talk about homegrown democracy theories. And for him, these homegrown domestic theories are neither socialism nor consensus, for the simple reason that he feels that these two are built on communitarianism, and communitarianism, according to him, pays allegiance to traditional communalism, and to try to apply tenets of traditional communalism to modern communities would be not justified, in the sense that there's a divorce between fact and theory. Now, he notices that there's a need to acknowledge that African communities after colonization really changed, and he gives us examples of urban dwellers, we have inner city tenants, we have backyard dwellers, shanty dwellers, and the homeless in the homeless. So for him, such historical narratives like the ones that were given by traditional communalism no longer suffice to deal with the challenges that are faced in the current era that we are in. Now, Matolino doesn't believe that Africa isn't capable of democratizing, but rather he believes that Africa is capable of democratizing, but the democracy that we are talking about need not be hinged on traditional communalism. So for him, both socialism and consensus democracy imprison the person in the sense that the individual cannot actualize and realize his or her inherent potential rights. And then maybe that just being my general understanding of Matolino's work, I'll move on to look at what I think are some of the positives in Matolino's theory. For instance, his Afro-communitarian democracy rescues individual rights from the clutches of communitarianism. And further, I feel like he should also be credited for being able to note that tradition and modernity independently mark off two distinguishable knowledge traditions or perspectives, or rather two ways of life which are rooted in different histories and economies. And yeah, as to my limitations of his theory, though, yeah, his limited communitarianism doesn't diminish the place of the community. It seeks to elevate the individual to the level of the community to make them at par. Neither is above the other. So in this way, Matolino manages to silence his critics, those that had argued that his political philosophy must not be grounded in communitarianism. So by elevating the individual to the same level with the community, he managed to silence his critics. But however, one can still question whether it is possible for this individual to exist, or for the individual to exist without the community. Now, Matolino addresses this by arguing that the individual exists and actualizes his or her individual potentialities in the community. Now, if this is the case, one might argue that ontologically, the community comes first before the individual, and functionally, the community is above the individual. Now, the community comes before the individual because for us to have the individual, there has to be a community. And the individual is not born into a vacuum. Even Matolino acknowledges this fact that the individual actualizes his or her individual in the community and not outside the community. So from this, functionally, the community plays a big role in the life of the individual, where the individual rights are defined and derived. If the community defines and provides rights, then it is functionally above the individual. Hence, the individual and the community cannot be at par, as Matolino argues. Maybe as my own observation, probably Matolino should have explained in detail the relationship between the community and the individual from the ontological and functional perspective. And with that, I rest my case. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Joyline, for your contribution. I'll now quickly invite Dr. Simon Makwinja to also give his response to Matolino's philosophy.
Thank you, Arabia. for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Thank you, everyone that is available this evening for this important philosophical kind of food, let's call it like that. I've been following what Professor Matolino has been saying. I interacted with him on many occasions, being my supervisor. I know his fears about communitarianism. I know his fears. I mean, initially he had feared about the communitarianism, and now he has a bit changed. He's moving towards not completely accepting it by modifying it to be something that is going to be acceptable in many ways, because the previous versions that we have read, we have seen, have got weaknesses that he thinks do not really promote the well-being of individuals. So I would like to begin talking about this. This is, I mean, we are experiencing so many changes in the global village, and I would like to say that those who did suggest, let's talk about our first leaders, political leaders in Africa, those who suggested that the political theories should be based on some traditional kind of thinking. I think this was a warning for me. This was a warning earlier on about what we had or what had been imposed on us as a way of doing things politically, economically, and many other ways. So I think that was the warning that there's something that is going to happen in the future. Of course, that was not, they did not make that explicit, but you could see from there. Of course, we are taught that they did that because they wanted to consolidate power. I mean, there are many critics who think they did that in order to consolidate power. But today, there are those problems that have been highlighted by Professor Matolino, the existential situation that Africa and its people find themselves in. So I'm not really sure whether the suggested Afro-communitarian theory, a political theory, is what actually it is going to do, because anything that is communitarian, I think there is a suggestion that it prioritizes the community, but maybe the problem is maybe the kind of community in which this person finds himself. So the current situation indeed undermines sociality as much as what was suggested to be the solution, namely, for example, such theories as Ubuntu. Professor Matolino declared it dead, that is no longer functional. We need to discard it and look elsewhere for theories that are going to take Africa elsewhere. The kind of problem that I have today with the sort of suggestions that have been made is that, yes, we have a community who is struggling. I mean, we have a person who is struggling because, I mean, he has freedom. I mean, today being, what can I say? We know this sort of, I mean, capitalism, the free market. I mean, everybody is free to do whatever he wants to do. And I think that should be the reason why most people find themselves on the peripherals of, I mean, real life, as it were. So I don't know whether this is not the time that would need the community to try to assist that kind of person. I mean, at least to be somewhere that is, I mean, more human than it is today, because Africa is becoming the worst place, or it is already, as he has said, that the worst place where human beings should live. we don't know where we are going, and I don't know how this so-called new, or not new, the Afro-communitarian kind of democracy is going, I mean, how it is going to work, because we will still have to talk about the same values that we think are not important today. I think we need maybe some kind of soul searching with regard to what we valorize to be the way that things should be. For example, those people that are leading, the political leaders, I don't think that they don't know that their countries are worse off than other countries in the world. I don't think they don't know that. But maybe because they lack freedom, I mean, they lack a responsibility. So here we are, a democracy that did emphasize on certain aspects. For example, freedom, which did not emphasize attendant responsibility. So this is what we had. I mean, and then when the continent was slowly turning into multi-party politics around 1990s, this is what we received, freedom. So this was the freedom that lacked responsibility. But I think in another way, the so-called traditional values or the value systems meant to instill the communities with the kind of responsibility that would put a human person, a human being, in some better position. But Prof. Matolino says, no, this is something that is dead. We cannot resuscitate something that is dead. It's dead, and it has to be discarded, and we need to have something new. So my problem is the existential situation that Africa finds itself in. How we can develop that theory without having to consider some things that have been suggested before as appropriate ways of dealing with these problems. Now, the so-called communitarianism emphasizes on this so-called let's say it's an ethical or a moral theory that tries to suggest some particular ways by which a human being can be accepted within that particular community. Now, if communitarianism has got certain values that it tries to change a human being to be somebody that is acceptable to the community, isn't that something that we want? Because today, I mean, the problem is freedom. We have learned that our freedoms do not have any limitations. Freedom, I mean, we can be as free as we want. That's why, because of that freedom, we are living in those, what you call the high fences. Because that freedom, I mean, that freedom also that freedom capacitates somebody who doesn't have anything to rob us of some things that we have worked for. So because of that freedom, we have those problems. But what is interesting in Matolino's way of thinking for me is his change from initially being a critic of communitarianism in the past and how he has moved and he has become very sympathetic to the cause of communitarianism, albeit that he is suggesting a different kind of communitarianism that he calls new, that is going maybe to forestall the sort of problems that Africa is meeting. So for me, this is a positive thing that Matolino hasn't been just a critic of various theories, whether they are Western philosophical theories or African philosophical theories, but his realization that a philosopher is not just there to philosophize from an armchair, talking about possibilities and impossibilities, but he's somebody who should be taking part in the plight of his people. And that's the reason I think now he has suggested, I mean, he has come back, for me, it's like he has come back and say, oh, we can rescue some things from our communitarianism and make it something that can deal with the problems that we have. So I don't have so much to say about Prof. Matolino's work, but I'm only happy, and I did not see this coming, that when he wrote his African communitarianism, I mean, democratic, what can I say? The book that he has just recently written, the 2018 book, where he talks about Afro-communitarian democracy, right? For me, that is a very big shift from the way he used to think, from the way he used to write about these African value systems. So I think this is a positive way philosophers are thinking now about what is outside their comfort zones. Now, talking about real things. So I think we have a lot of work to do as philosophers, especially those from this continent, to think about the realities that Africa finds herself in. I don't think our friends elsewhere on in other continents will be interested. I think they have also their own problems which they are dealing with. We have our problems that they are dealing with. So I applaud Prof. Matolino for coming back to think about African real situations now and say, let's rescue the people by providing robust philosophical theories, theories that do not only talk about things that are possible, but things that can actually happen. So I would like to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Simon Makwinja, for your response. I will now finally call on Dr. Motsamai Molefe to give his own thoughts on Professor Matolino's philosophy.
Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to the organizers, and a special thanks goes to our brother, Professor Matolino, for unfolding himself in the way that he has done, by making pen to marry paper and to share his thoughts with us. We really learned a lot from his writings. We've been influenced greatly by his philosophy. And we're truly, truly grateful for the opportunity to sit under the shadow of his wisdom and hide from the scorching sun of ignorance that surrounds us in Africa and many other parts of the world. Without much ado, I just have a few things to share. Very disorganized thoughts, but I believe that they will really, I hope that they will take us somewhere. I want to start by talking on personhood, taking a cue from Matolino himself, from personhood. The thought he expressed, which I found to be very interesting, the distinction between metaphysical and communitarian conceptions of personhood. I must admit I've never understood the distinction, but there's ways in which he has been able to facilitate very important discussions about that particular distinctions. And the idea that he expressed that I found interesting, that he has been a loner in prioritizing or focusing on the metaphysical aspects of personhood, So maybe just to respond to that particular issue. So firstly, the question about how to think about the metaphysical aspects of personhood. So for example, you see Wiredu Jeje and Gabrielson give conceptions of the various cultural groups of what constitutes a person, very interesting metaphysical schemas. And I think Matolino's intervention in that regard in his 2014 book is very interesting. But there are other ways that other philosophers have intervened in the metaphysical discussions on personhood. Obviously, they intervene with different orientations, given the purposes of their projects. Look at the work of Ikunube. Look at the work of Ikunube. So Ikunube draws a distinction between the metaphysical and the normative. Right? Well, a careless reader will think that his interest is on the normative, or what Matolino calls the communitarian. But if you read him carefully, you'll realize that in his intervention, he suggests that the metaphysical and the normative cannot be separated. In fact, the metaphysical informs the communitarian or the normative conception, right? So, and he does something that is philosophically interesting, which I'm not aware of a philosopher who has jumped into this insight. And then immediately, when he plays with this distinction, he employs the concept of what philosophers called a thick concept. So for Ikunube, the concept of personhood is a thick concept as opposed to a thin one. A thick concept is defined as one that marries the normative/evaluative and the metaphysical. The ontological, the metaphysical and the normative are married together. But at once, this concept has got the metaphysical, and simultaneously, the same concept has got the normative, right? And so he describes it as having these two elements, right? And what has not been done, however, and this Ikunube does not do this, is to think about what are the implications of thinking of personhood as a thick concept. And I think there's a lot going on there, which people interested in personhood and emerging young scholars should latch into and think critically about concepts that at once is ontological and at once is metaphysical. One beautiful possible consequence of that way of thinking, of bridging with the metaphysical, is that it allows us to rethink that meta-ethical problem that has to deal with you can't derive, is the claim that you can't derive a moral claim from a metaphysical claim. Right? They say that you can't derive a moral claim from a metaphysical claim. It's a standard doctrine in moral philosophy. But thick concepts seem to promise exactly that kind of derivation. What we expect human beings to be able to achieve is a function of how we conceive of them metaphysically. So I think it's not entirely correct that for Matolino to think that he's been a loner. In the way that he's been approaching the subject, he might be a loner, but in the way that colleagues have started thinking about the metaphysics, he has not been a loner. And you can see how then, for example, if you follow Ikunube's trajectory of thought, he plays with this conjoined concept of the normative, the communitarian, and the metaphysical. What he has done with it now, he has stretched it to considerations of human dignity. He has stretched it to considerations of human rights. So he has used this very thick concept to enter into discussions about political theory. And he believes that this particular conception allows him to enter into debates about human rights. I'm not sure I agree with him, but I'm saying there is that particular journey that one can follow in thinking about the metaphysics, and then the deeper question then, which I think that's where African philosophers should focus, is what are the contents, what is the metaphysical content that constitutes a person, right? One that could be available to a secular culture, right? Suppose someone does not believe that human beings have got okra, as we really would have it, and someone wants to ground a robust construction of human philosophical anthropology, then the question would be, what would be that content? What would be that content, right? So there's that consideration about personhood. Another interesting caveat to that throws itself as we think about personhood, particularly if you think about politics and if you think about ethics, and it's something that I think we've not paid attention to, and I don't think it emerges significantly in the words of Prof. Matolino, but it's something that is latent. It's a question of agency. Question of agency. The concept of an agent and agency, they seem to be very central in these considerations. So one of the critical questions that we have to ask ourselves, and this is a metaphysical question, is how do we account for agency? What constitutes agency? What constitutes agency? Particularly as we think of in the context of how we think of personhood, right? How we think of agency, because it seems even if you're committed to the normative concept of personhood, what is required is that you require an agent who's going to be able to conduct themselves in a particular way, right? But what we have focused on is someone who is able to achieve this particular thing. But what we have not thought about is how do we construe an agent? How do we construe an agent? And what constitutes an agent? What constitutes an agent? And this, I think, would have enriched our discussion in African philosophy, because it would have pushed us to do the dirty metaphysical work of thinking about what constitutes agents. And this would have thrown us in very, very interesting directions. Two such directions present themselves to me. On the one hand, we would have thought about the place of rationality or / autonomy in African thought. We would have thought about that very seriously. And would have thought about how is this conception of thought in relation to thinking of agency different from other traditions, right? How is it different from the Kantian tradition? How is it different from Rawlsian contractual scheme? How is it different from those? And more interestingly, how is it different from a feminist conception? Right? How does our construction of agency correspond and differ from those? And our discussions of personhood have not gone in that direction. And I suppose that's the direction that has been very interesting as we think about that. Another area in which our discussion of personhood has been, particularly in relation to agency, is that we've not thought very seriously about the place of emotions. Place of emotions in constructing an agent, an agency, and whether and how important that is. Right? But if you're going to talk about things like freedom, it seems that you cannot avoid thinking quite seriously about this idea of these emotions, right? Particularly one of the fundamental aspects that have to do with freedom are things like desires and being able to pursue your desires, are things like interests and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in metaphysical conceptions of personhood, which I think, unfortunately, in the current state of the literature, much of it has not been attended to. So I think those are just two thoughts I wanted to throw out there in relation to personhood. But maybe the one last thought in relation to personhood, which is important, is that one of the ways in which our considerations of personhood have been poor, it's, and this point leads to my considerations about politics, is how we have allowed foreign discussions on human rights to become a standard for thinking about a lot of things in African thoughts. If the very first debate between Mefyane Mengiti and Jeje, and I think I blame Mengiti for this, for no reason, for no justification at all, he throws the idea of rights. And then Jeje goes mad about it to say, no, rights are important. And as you read the works of scholars like Matolino, you get a sense that I don't call it that virus, let me call it that virus infects them and infects us as scholars, because we've spent so much time thinking, particularly about individual rights. But what we have not done carefully is to stand back and think about why is the agenda of thinking of what is important about a human being must be framed in terms of rights. That's the question that we've often evaded. And this question I've always thought is important because important communitarian, our cousins, communitarians from the West, have expressed doubt about this concept of rights. They've expressed doubt about this concept of rights. And the doubt that they've expressed is a doubt that should have made a lot of sense to us, that the idea of rights gives a particular conception of how to think about the importance of an individual, which is different from how communitarians tend to think about the importance of individuals. But because we didn't take care of that distinction, which is based on two distinct theoretical frameworks. So these are two theoretical frameworks. You've got a communitarian theoretical framework and you've got a liberal theoretical framework. And both of them have a conception of the importance of an individual. What I find very strange, even in the discussion as you read Matolino's 2014 book on personhood, is the idea of personhood, thinking of the importance of an individual in terms of rights. It's very important. And why? I don't understand. There are other ways to think about the importance of individuals and protecting what's important about them without invoking rights. How African philosophy got so in love with human rights, I don't know. Maybe we're influenced by the reality that came with the Declaration of Universal Human Rights. Maybe that empirical reality is the one that has shaped our thinking. I'm not sure we should have allowed it to influence us, and I've got good reasons why we should not have allowed it to influence us. I've got good reasons, historical and philosophical. But in the interest of time, I will not pursue those. Let me turn my attention to questions of politics. One of the things that stands out throughout Matolino's work on political theory, it's his love for a kind of approach to politics that appreciates the extant empirical conditions, the reality that confronts us. And that's why even in his elucidations, he talks about Zimbabwe, he talks about South Africa. If you've listened to him, like I've listened to him in other places, he will also take you to many other places in the continent, some of the strangest townships, like the most dangerous townships, to show you the condition of human beings in Africa. I've always loved that about him because it really seeks to ground philosophy where it should be to deal with real issues, right? I love that about him. But what I have found to be very curious, as a philosopher, it's the blind spot on how we look into this reality, the blind spot that seems to manifest itself. And by that I mean, if you read Samir Amin, a paper where he discusses how Africa was organized by colonialism, that Africa was divided into three. And this division was economic, right? It was divided into three parts. So the division of Africa was created. And all these three parts were connected to the West in a particular way. And this created the debilitation and the deterioration and the weakness of Africa, because it was now made to be a supply. It was made to serve the interests of the West, right? Post-independence politics, what we have done, we've not thought very hard about that condition of dependence that creates weakness in Africa. What we tend to do, and I think that's what's happening here, we overlook the persisting colonial and neo-colonial structure of the world that creates these conditions in Africa. So while we are looking at reality, the structural reality that informs the perpetuation of that reality, we overlook it. Right? So if we were serious about doing proper political reality that looks into the real conditions of Africa, so one of the questions that we should be asking is, how is the structure of the world globally influencing conditions in Africa? We're dealing reality here. We're not doing anything theoretical. Reality. What is reality? How are global structures influencing this? And we go further. The nation states that we have inherited The nation state that we've inherited, with a mess of different competing ethnic groups that we've inherited, imposed borders, right? And weak, the intended weak sovereignty of African states that cannot sustain themselves, that are made to report. That condition of this state that we have copied from Europe, that continue, that's why you can have Zimbabwe, you can have South Africa, all of that, which is a gift that we have copied and has been imposed from us from Europe, and we just add the moniker of democracy to it. That's a reality, that structural reality that we're overlooking. But the invention of Africa has persisted even beyond the so-called post-colonial, into the post-colonial societies, because the structure of the world still continues to favor the global north, economically and otherwise. And if we look into that reality using the colonial lenses, then we must be very suspicious even of entering into conversations about democracy in the first place, when we have not sat down on a table and thought about how are we going to invent Africa in a way that is able to, in a way that is going to remedy the colonial organizations of Africa, which we have not thought about, right? And think about what modes of thought and what modes of organization we're going to employ. So that's a reality that I think if Matolino would take a step back from the current reality and think about the structural reality that informs, which is a function of the global order of the world, I think his political theory would move in a different direction. And this then allows me then to respond to his criticisms of Ubuntu in this way. Often than not, it is not that UNU is failing. It is that the colonial trappings are still ensuring that Ubuntu is not possible, because we have put human beings in conditions where they cannot pursue, where they cannot achieve Ubuntu. So that's the problem is structural. It's not that Ubuntu has come to an end. It is that conditions that ensure that Ubuntu cannot exist still hold. So the minute we look into those structural issues about the global organization of politics, you start realizing these issues so we cannot talk meaningfully of Ubuntu, right? Because it's not possible, because the conditions don't quite permit, because we still have weak states that no one takes seriously anywhere in the world, because we are still the victims of infantilization, which is created by the West. And we have not had leaders who are seriously thinking about how to respond at that structural level, the structure that creates these conditions. And for example, maybe as a parting shot, as an example of the problem that we face of xenophobia, right? So where there's a border between South Africa and Zimbabwe, and this border is a function of that imposed way of thinking of a state from the West, right? Where communitarianism would come very, very useful as an African theoretical lens, where it will come very useful is to think of the notion of community implies a border. The notion of community implies a border, right? So communitarianism is different from cosmopolitanism. So communitarianism implies and requires a border, right? You're going to have a community. So one of the things that we have not thought about, how does communitarianism think about borders? What will be these borders? But the difficulty also is made even worse in a place like South Africa, where you've got a constitution, for example, that talks about human rights. And these human rights, you have them because you're human, but you want to deprive human beings of accessing these rights because of a border. Right. So communitarianism, if it was serious as a philosophical intervention on how to think about this question, was to say, how do we think about borders? Outside of this colonial imposition, how do we think about borders? Look, Africans have always had communities, they've always had ways of thinking about borders. But what we've been lazy to do is how to think about these borders, right? So there are people who have tried to think about this, but I don't think much work has been done. And if we can't meaningfully think about borders when we think of a community, can't meaningfully think about borders, then we have to think about how do we meaningfully get rid of borders and then create a cosmopolitan politics, right? So as we think about the failure of consensus, and we want to think of Afro-communitarianism, So if consensus fails, we can accept that consensus has failed, but it means that we've got a responsibility to think about how to think about politics, what central really is going to organize that. But if we think of Afro-community and community, then we've got a bigger responsibility of saying, where are we going to draw the border when we think of a community? Is this going to be something continental, or is it still going to have a nation state organized around different ethnic groups, right? So those are deeper questions that I think philosophers have to think about. And I think that's a direction that we as philosophers have to think about. And until we've thought seriously about what constitutes a community, what's the content of this community, what political goods that this community provide, I think we are still very far from doing serious African political work. And one place that I found to have some promise is the work of Henry Orico's ideas. I think there's something going on there. But just in terms of the content of a community and all of that. And then when those conditions are there, then we can then make a fair assessment to say, look, Ubuntu, there's the end of Ubuntu. We can make those fair assessments when those conditions, structural conditions that can allow human beings to be able to express themselves. I think I'm going to leave it at that and say thanks a lot to Prof. Matolino for trying to push us in a particular direction. And one of the insights, maybe this is one of the insights that I hope we will see coming out more fully in his work. There's the idea of difference that's very important in his work, which I think deserves a book. I've challenged him on this. I think how to deal with difference is a serious issue, and how to make sense of difference in African thought. There's that idea, but there's another idea. When you read Consensus, just at the beginning, he imagines a political polity that responds to human needs. Imagine that kind of political polity. It will be very interesting to see that kind of work also finding a place in his body of work to say, what kind of a political order is this that will respond to needs, right? Responds to needs. So as far as democracy is concerned, as far as rights and democracy is concerned, personally, I'm not a fan. I think those concepts are concepts that as an ideology used to stop important conversations to happen in African thought about taking charge of our situation in reimagining or inventing Africa. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Molefe, for your very robust contribution and response. Very quickly, I would invite Professor Matolino to give his thoughts on some of the ideas that have been, put forward by the discussants. So, Professor Matolino, over to you.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for the engagement. It's really appreciated. Without wasting any time, let me turn to Dr. Gwara. And the interesting point that she really raises, which can be taken as a critique of my work, has got to do with the two things. She first continues with the long tradition in communitarianism that we've come to be accustomed to, which insists that the community is prior to the individual, the inevitability of the community, that as a matter of biological, metaphysical, or social fact, everybody is born into a kind of a community. But what is not normally stated by supporters of this line of thinking is that they assume that whoever is born into a community, or when they claim that everybody is born into a community is made, necessarily that must be a functional or a good community. That is not always the case. You can be born into a broken community. You can be born into a dysfunctional community. You can be born into a disempowering community, a community that will destroy you, actually, a community that stunts you in very serious ways. And I don't know what to do with that brute fact when things are like that. So the fact that the community comes before the individual as a matter of logical necessity does not mean that the community will always be good for the individual. So I don't know what to do with that. I mean, we can say it, but at that level, it's troublesome, particularly with my approach, which wants to look at these communities, how they manifest themselves. I find some of those communities, to be born into a poor community must trouble you. I mean, you must not be pleased or even accept that you were born into a poor community, because it's not in your interest. So some communities are simply not in the individual's interest. Then, excuse me, she pushes the matter further, and then she says, I must have explained the ontological and functional relation between individuals and community. I do think because of a commitment, then necessarily she must make this demand. But if she was neutral, she wouldn't have made this demand, because as she acknowledges, I place the community and the individual as equal. And I go further to explain that their concomitant existence is one of shaping each other. And I will repeat this over and over again. The fact that Dr. Gwara points to of the individual coming into a community does not take seriously the idea that a community is not a natural occurrence. It is a product of human endeavor. It is a creation of human desire and human will, including human manipulations, to a particular end, which may not necessarily always save everybody in that community, but which may save certain interests. I don't want to sound Marxist or Foucauldian, but we know that communities are not always about servicing everybody equally. It's one of the greatest fallacies that has been peddled around in African communitarian thinking, that communities are equally good for everyone as long as you abide by their dictates. That if you just step a little back and look at what I try to advocate, you will find me wanting to demonstrate that a community is something that is essentially a product of human endeavor. And as it is a product of human endeavor, modern humans must be allowed, at least theoretically, to endeavor to produce something that is not necessarily in keeping with the traditional ethos of community in African thinking. That's what my commitment goes towards. It's not more sophisticated than that. But it's fine if you can make that demand, and then I can say to you, the explanation lies in exactly what I've just said to you. I don't know how you can take that. But that's my response to Dr. Gwara. And then I can move on to Dr. Makwinja. Dr. Makwinja is advanced interesting assertions around issues of freedom. And he suggests that we must either hold freedom central to the misfortunes that we see, or we must at least analyze the role that freedom has played in facilitating the unfolding of these misfortunes that seem to obsess my descriptions and my theorization. I find that fascinating, because I sincerely think that it's a misleading position. It's a misleading position in the sense that if we think about freedom, and I don't know what definition we'll be working with, but at the very least, if we think about the sort of political freedom that I was talking about, which all human beings in the world are subjected to, the political measure, or the measurement of the political freedom of every citizen of this world, which Africans are also subjected to, you find that Africans are the least free people today, right now. And you look at the history of modern Africa, the idea of colonialism was premised on not promoting the freedom of the African, but stunting the African. Now, that was a successful project. The African was disenfranchised as an equal citizen in his backyard. As he was disenfranchised as an equal citizen in his backyard, what unfolded? The dehumanization, no freedom at all to participate effectively in your own affairs, no freedom at all to determine who you are, etc., etc. And cunningly, the first wave of leaders of independent Africa came and juked Africans into existing under lesser freedom that some people even existed under during the colonial era. And to talk of freedom right now on the continent is for me highly problematic, not only politically, but where individuals are not given the power to be free. To be free necessarily means the ability to make choices responsibly, and you've got a range of choices that are meaningful to you, and you can make those choices and you can be held accountable for the choices that, but there is just no infrastructure that allows you to make those choices, and there is just no way that we can say you are free in even the remotest of senses. You are just a subject, if not a victim, of circumstances that are way beyond your control, circumstances that were written long before your great-grandfather was born. Think of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and think of how King Leopold's experiment with that country effectively condemns the majority of the citizens of that country up to this day. So to think that notions of freedom apply, this is like a highly set deterministic course that you just live through as an African without any ability to transform yourself. I always tell this story. I may sit here as a university don, and I'll be very foolish to think that it is only through my effort that I sit here. It is through extreme luck, fortuitous events that led me to be here. I could just as well be a car guard. And I'm telling you, there are many car guards who are more intelligent than most professors. But because Africa is vicious in the way that it is, it takes away any sense of responsibility. And what is exercised by many people is an artificial representation of freedom, which in essence is a reaction to a number of untenable circumstances that bewilder and drive people crazy. It's just as simple as that. Then the second interesting point that was made is the sort of change that Makwinja notices. I do not notice that change, but I don't think most of us notice the change that happens in our work. Other people notice that. So the change that happens here is said to be of moving from being a former critique of communitarianism to offering some support of communitarianism. I find that input very interesting because some people accuse me actually of not holding on to a communitarian version. But what I just want to say in respect of my commitment to communitarianism will be similar to what I've just said now, or in response to Dr. Gwara. I am only interested in the type of communitarianism that takes seriously the possibility that the individuals who compose that community have got the capacity to shape the community in the way that they see to be able to serve their interests best. That's all that really matters. So I'm not the kind of communitarian who will prioritize the facts of community preceding the facts of individuality. I say facts of individuality combine interestingly to create facts of community. Now you may ask, where do those facts of individuality come from? Don't they come from the community? I don't think they necessarily always come from the community in a like seamless manner. They may come from the community, but what the community issues is what is interesting here, in the sense that the community may issue things that cause individuals to turn against the current standing or the status quo of the community and demand a new community. This is how revolutionary societies are born. And in Africa, we are told transition in Africa is not through revolution, but it's through the naturalness of seeing something as fit for purpose. And of course, it goes to the old definitions of community. So in as far as the communitarian project I have in mind is concerned, it is one that insists on allowing individuals to play their role in enabling new realities to unfold, and new realities that are pertinent to their own concerns. So I'm interested in freely creating agents who fashion their reality in response to the here and now. And of course, they may have an appreciation of history, and they may have an inclination towards taking responsibility for the future. But in their construction of community, or in their expenditure of their energies on issues that are community related, they should be allowed to create whatever form of community they see fit. If Africans are living a reality that espouses individualism, then we shouldn't shy away from describing that reality and the community reality that issues from that as a community of individuals and a community of distanced people. It still is a community. The idea of communities that are going is what has been abused in African thinking, such that every time the word community is invoked, we think of the Jechi Menkiti debate. There are many types of communities, and I'm interested in those types of communities and in the creation of the state, just the state, not even the nation state. All those communities must be represented so that the agency of individuals who emerge from those communities is accurately captured at both the normative and the practical level. Then I come to Professor Molefe, whose input on the issue of metaphysics is interesting. And his citation of Ikenobe is very interesting, because Ikenobe is one professor that I've battled with very hard, and we've had very recent scathing battles where he does not accept anything I say, and I do not accept anything he says. That's just how the way it is. It shall not be surprising to anybody who does philosophy. I've come across what Molefe describes as this thick normative account of personhood. And I must be very frank, I never thought anything of it. It's one of those things in your area that you come across and you read it and you finish reading it and you just don't react either way. And that's what has happened here. Molefe's characterization of Ikenobe will probably differ from how I characterize Ikenobe, particularly on the issue of the different use of metaphysics and the attempt by Ikenobe to say metaphysics must be seen as a forerunner to the community. And then metaphysics becomes an informant of a certain type of community. Of course, that is interesting, but here's the tricky part. There are two tricky parts to it. The first one is that there is a switch of authority. And I don't think it should be done so easily, that even though I like metaphysical orientation. So the switch is like this. There are many people who say, whatever the metaphysical story tells us, it must ultimately end with the community story. Here you get a different game from how I understand it. The game is, let us understand what the metaphysical components are and let us see how they could be manifested in a community setup. Now, of course, if you're going to take issues of community seriously, whatever the metaphysical orientations are going to be, they will be forced to tell a story that satisfies some measure of what a community is. And we know how that story always ends up in Africa, particularly where theorization on the community is involved. It never allows the full agency of the metaphysically construed individuals to play itself out. So that's a difficulty I have there. But I must admit, this is welcome new thinking, but I think a bit of it is Molefe, not so much Ikenobe. So it will be interesting to hear what Molefe's own ideas on ways in which metaphysics can emerge on the social platform would be, because I have a commitment, certainly, that metaphysics must be allowed a free range, that whatever emerges will always be a community of sorts, but it may not necessarily be a communitarian community. Hence, I say the community itself must reflect the urgency of the people who are shaping it, because their efforts in shaping it rewards them by giving them a reality that is tenable for their existence. Which takes us to the second concern that was raised by Molefe, where he says, I have not clearly explicated what my idea of urgency is. And I will admit to that. And why I did not do it is because I had assumed that it would be obvious to any reader what urgency is. But my own thinking on urgency is not very complicated. It's very simple, and I'm happy to share it with you. If you want a complicated account of urgency in community and responsible urgency in responsible communities, I'll refer you to the work of Axel Honneth, but I did not even rely on it because I just assumed that type of urgency will intuitively be appealing to whoever was reading my work. But I admit, maybe I should explain what I mean by urgency. But in essence, what I have in mind when I talk about urgency is just the individual's ability to meaningfully participate in community. Now, that's a very serious thing, and I take it absolutely seriously. You cannot be considered an urgent if you cannot participate meaningfully in your community. And worse, if you do not have an ability to shape it. We are all members of the community or of a community. But our membership should not be one that accepts to its logical conclusion what Dr. Gwara was suggesting, that we must reckon with the reality of being born into a community. We must also reckon with the reality of fractured communities that desperately need our repair. And outdated communities, as Wiredu tells us, that need to be thrown out so that we can invent usable realities and usable theories to account for those realities. So when I talk about an agent and the urgency of that agent, I'm talking about meaningful and rewarding participation in what you consider to be a community, as well as responsibility in shaping the final outlook of that community. Of course, the degrees of success in this will vary depending on a number of factors, but that is the essence and that is what is required. What we see now is the exact opposite. You are born into a fractured community and the community eventually kills you by limiting, stunting your life opportunities up to a point where you get physically sick and you die, or you get so hungry that you die, or you don't die now, you just live a life of prolonged suffering. And then Molefe took us to the issue of emotions. And I think I agree with him. As we all know in philosophy, emotions have been debated for a very long time. Even in Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, which tells us that the activity of the soul, particularly the thinking part of the soul, is the essence of man. Emotions feature, and emotions have got to be reckoned with. But here I follow exactly that, the Aristotelian route. Emotions, like other intellectual capacities, have got to be nurtured. And we cannot give them room until we are sure that we have got agents who are properly formed. And what do I mean by the task of the community in freeing our people from ignorance, freeing our people from being average, freeing our people from destitution is great. Yet the community itself as a reality that Gwara describes does not seem even slightly attuned towards addressing those issues. So to expect an individual who is not properly developed as an agent to then come out in community and exercise properly cultivated emotions is going to be problematic, because emotions are a wide range, right? Emotions range from those emotions that we think are admirable, such as affection for your community, up to outbursts against your community, or anger, or whatever, or fury, or murderous intentions. Yeah. Then Molefe suggests to us that there are other important ways of thinking of the importance of the individual in relation to the community besides rights. And I agree with that. I agree. I don't know, as a term of measurement, how readers of my work will see me as advocating rights. But where I advocate rights, I think I use them as a foil against the excesses of modern African communities against their own people. So the first line of defense for the individual is to invoke rights. Why? Because when you invoke rights, it means that there is a tension to whatever degree between yourself and that particular community. And I agree with Molefe, it has become a common universal measure. It's just something that people accept as usable in talking about these issues. Then the final contribution from Molefe on politics, and I'll respond to this quickly. He talks at length about a blind spot that it can be found in my work, the structural invention of Africa. And I agree with that. But my own thinking is that this has been addressed sufficiently in literature. And if you go to my democracy's consensus, I give an indication of this debate and my separation between internalists and externalists. They are both trying to account for how Africa's problems came about, and by implication, how Africa was created to be of the sort that exhibits these problems. You see, we lack either the intellectual capacity, or the political ability, or the moral will to overcome this structural invention of Africa. We lack it at all levels, at the academic level, political level, economic level, social level. We just are not prepared. In fact, we are eager to defend the borders that were created. Now, you can try to work out what is responsible for such a reaction, and then you'll start saying interesting things about colonialism and its after effects. But that is the case. That is the reality that confronts us. And all of us who are on this forum and those who are not on this forum will have to think really hard. And many people have been thinking really hard about how to overcome this. Look, Europeans have done it with the European Union. And Britain was ridiculous in exiting the European Union. It was a laughing stock. They've done it. And maybe it has been a project long time coming, but they've done it. We do not appear to be taking even the first step towards that long project. So I'll say to Molefe, it's one of the many things that are curious about Africans and being African. These borders appear to be sacrosanct to us. African unity is one of the most rhetorical things that we just sing ever since independence. And we do not have any intention, plan, theory, or mode of implementing this. And then finally, Molefe talks about the need to understand that Ubuntu has got to be understood as operating in an environment that is alien to its realization. Fair enough, but we must also appreciate that we have got an obligation or a duty to rethink this environment, because Ubuntu is not going to transform this environment, to rethink this environment in terms of other appropriate theoretical considerations. Thank you. That will be my response.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof, for your robust response to the discussants. I think because of time, we will just take one or two sets of 3 questions from the audience. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand and then I'll call you. I can see Amara has a hands up. So Amara, could you very briefly and quickly ask your question? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Matolino. Thank you also to the discussants for such an interesting discussion. My question is this, directly to Professor Matolino. Why call your theory limited communitarianism when you hold on to the metaphysical conception of personhood? Now, secondly, if personhood is defined as independent of the community, in what sense is your theory communitarian? Thank you.
All right, Paul, you can ask your question, and then after you, I can invite Professor Matolino to respond. Paul Michael, you can unmute. If Paul is not ready, let me just invite Prof. Matolino to respond to Amara's question briefly.
The theory is called limited communitarianism because it clearly states that there are limits that are placed on the community's claims over the individual. In particular, I was working with the dominant theories on communitarianism on the continent, the so-called radical and moderate communitarianism, which both advocate that the individual is not as important as the community's considerations. So I say, I do not know what the source of that thinking is, and I do not know how the source of that thinking may lead to people arriving at such a conclusion. But I do know the source of my thinking, of the nature of the brutality of so-called communities in Africa. And I know how that brutality can easily be used to undermine and sometimes destroy the individual. So that's why I call my theory limited communitarianism. And why do I take community seriously? When I'm committed to a metaphysical view, I take community seriously because I think community is indispensable. The only debate I have with people is what type of community do we have in mind? I think there are varieties of communities, but communities, as long as they respond to the individual's efforts at shaping them, that's good. For example, in Africa, many people live in countries that can be seen as destructive communities. And it's one debate to have, but that's my reason.
All right, Paul, are you ready to ask a question?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. Although I've sent out a chart, but let me just ask it quickly. My query is that it seems that Professor Matolino has excluded young adults and adolescents from the class of people who are able to be called agents. And if that is the case, that might just be the same problem that Minkiti himself raises by excluding the young. So I would like a clarification on this. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Paul. Prof. Matolino, just briefly, your response.
There's somewhere I wrote where I explicitly excluded them because I don't seem to remember that. But I don't know. You know, sometimes you can be tripped up by a strange sentence from your own book and you say, wow, did I read? But I don't know. I mean, if I wrote something like that, I'll want to retract it now. Look, the issue of urgency, I would understand, even amongst adults, the urgency will not be uniform. It will be different. some people with greater intellectual capacity may be more influential agents who are interesting and who can contribute more positively or more destructively to their society than simple people, etc. So I think agency is an unfolding process, and it's easy to work out who is ready to be an agent when they show themselves to have a certain responsible outlook and a certain maturity that we consider consistent with decision making. Now, I know some work in psychology will tell you at what age you may consider somebody to be responsible. That's why lots of legislation puts consent for sex at 16 and voting at 18, and others put drinking at 21. I'm not too fussy about those things, but I think it's a nice debate to have only when agency is assured. So right now my battle is agency even for adults is not assured on the continent. That's the real trouble. So I'm happy to have adolescents in the discussion, as long as they are not going to be too immature about things. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Do we have any other question? Okay, I don't see any other hand up. Perhaps I'll just ask one question for Professor Matolino. Throughout your career, you've been a big critic of the idea of Ubuntu and the fact that it reflects pristine African ethics, as it were. And part of the reasons you seem to believe this is that nothing in contemporary Africa reflects this Ubuntu that we talk about. And of course, we cannot have knowledge of pre-colonial, at least complete a full picture of pre-colonial societies, such that we can accurately depict what Ubuntu is like in these pre-colonial societies. But my question is, are those requirements necessary? Can't Ubuntu be sort of like a theory that, yes, African philosophers have concocted and devised for themselves, but still a viable theory of ethics? Because the question now is not about the origins of the theory, but the content and the plausibility of the theory that has now been imagined and concocted by African scholars. So the question is, if the content of Ubuntu is plausible, would you agree that it is a viable ethic for Africa? Yeah.
Oh, well, you see, the proverbial "you can't have your cake and eat it too" applies here and to everybody who thinks like that. Why? Because you see, this is the thing. Those who theorize on Ubuntu and those who say whatever they want to say on Ubuntu are all agreed that this is ultimate reality for African people. If it is ultimate reality for African people, then what you must understand is that there is a very deep relationship between the theorization of Ubuntu and the application of Ubuntu. In fact, the two are almost inseparable. It is one of those philosophical luxuries that as philosophers we think we are entitled to indulge ourselves in. We come along and we find something going on, and then we take it from its practitioners and we think about it and we refine it the way we want. And we say, this is my theory and it has got nothing to do with reality. Well, unfortunately, with Ubuntu, I want to argue very, very strongly that that luxury is not there. It should not be permitted. Anybody who does that is being irresponsible, or they want to mislead people on very, very important things. This is why some people who have written on Ubuntu have been accused of peddling their own private ideas about Ubuntu. And they've been told openly that they should call Ubuntu by their own surnames, as we'll do with Kant. To say it's a Kantian theory, it's a Chimakonamian theory, it's a Molefian theory, Matolinian theory. If you're talking about Ubuntu, you are extrapolating a theory from reality, but that theory must necessarily reflect that reality. In any case, what thinkers of Ubuntu are doing is not radically different from earlier anthropologists who were on excursions on the African continent with the aim of describing how Africans live. Whether one wants to theorize about that, you can go and read your conversations with Okotomeli, or you can read Temple's Bantu philosophy and anything in between. Whether one wants to theorize about that and write interesting insights about the practice, whatever insights that you have about the practice which are theoretical cannot veer off that practice. What does that mean then for your question? It means that the conditions under which Ubuntu is realized are absolutely necessary for theorization about Ubuntu. Because Ubuntu is such a practical thing, you cannot remove anything at all that has got to do with its practice and realization from your thinking about Ubuntu. So if you're going to concoct a theory and insist that it is within your rights to articulate that theory without regard to practice, then it's an Atoian theory. We recognize it as Ubuntu. And you should be bold enough to say, why don't people say, I'm developing this theory from Ubuntu? Why do people still insist that this is Ubuntu? So that's the problem I have. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Matolino. And on that note, I'd like to thank you, Professor, and the discussants for taking out time to have this conversation, this roundtable conversation. We are very much happy to have you. I would now invite Professor Jonathan Chimakona to give a vote of thanks so that we can close the meeting. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, moderator, Dr. Arabia Atsu, for that wonderful outing. Permit me also to thank in a special way our special guest, presenter for today, Professor Bernard Matolino. Well, started off as a controversial African philosopher and has maintained fidelity to such controversies ever since. The interesting thing is that, as my teacher once said, that if a philosopher gave a talk and there was no controversy emanating from the talk, then that talk was not a philosophical talk. So it's a good thing that Matolino spices our philosophical experience in Africa with a fair dose of controversies, things to lead us into thinking and arguing. And of course, permit me to thank the discussants who took him to task and raised questions that push him to an edge, to compel him to deepen his thoughts and clarify some of his ideas. And I'm talking of Dr. Joyline Gwara, as well as Dr. Simon Makwinja and Dr. Motsamai Molefe. Thank you very much, colleagues. You have done a very good job. Those of us in the audience enjoyed it from start to finish. And on that note, I want to thank everyone who was able to join us from different parts of the world for this very edition, and to also enjoin you to continue to join us for subsequent editions of this program. Back to you, the moderator. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Chimakonam, for that vote of thanks. Once again, thanks to Professor Bernard Matolino, Dr. Joyline Gwara, Dr. Simon Makwinja, and Dr. Motsamai Molefe for gracing this event and speaking to us and engaging with the work and philosophy of Professor Matolino. We've been recording this event, so in a couple of hours, maybe before the next working day, we'll be able to view this event on our YouTube channel. Feel free to subscribe. It will be available for everyone. So thank you again, the audience, for spending time to speak with us. I will not waste much of your time. I'll say goodbye and see you in the next edition. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.